Please join me in welcoming Deputy Director Jamal to the stage.
Thank you, Combis, and thank you for inviting FinCEN to be part of this year's Emerging Technology Forum. This is my first time at ACT-IACT, and it presents a unique opportunity for FinCEN to interact with a group outside our customary audiences in the financial sector and law enforcement communities. You have a great agenda today covering public and private and state, federal, and global issues in the emergency technology space, and you're addressing important issues. I'm going to keep my remarks brief today and focus on the following topics. Making sure that you understand what FinCEN is, who we are, what we do, and why you should care. And given the topics you are addressing today, I'm going to talk about FinCEN efforts to encourage and recognize the importance of public and private sector coordination on innovation, particularly in areas where innovation and regulatory efforts need to be thought of in tandem and not in isolation from one another. I'm going to talk a little bit about FinCEN's role in regulatory efforts with respect to virtual currency. And finally, I want to talk to you about something in the anti-money laundering regulatory space we call a culture of compliance, and the importance of understanding and fostering a culture of compliance with respect to emerging technologies and in an international context. I'm going to start by thanking the FinCEN staff that put together the video presentation you just saw. It was an inside job, and it reflects the seriousness and the passion FinCEN staff put into the work that they do. From that short clip, you should understand that FinCEN was established as an important bridge between the financial sector and law enforcement to ensure that both are in the best position to fight illicit activity. In our bridging role, FinCEN, as the Financial Intelligence Unit, or FIU, of the United States, collects valuable intelligence primarily from the financial sector for use in aiding law enforcement efforts. Our collective goal with law enforcement is to follow the money as a key method of identifying and stopping illicit actors. In our regulatory role, we also ensure that in addition to reporting valuable information, financial institutions make themselves resilient to illicit actors. Although it's not all that we do, you can sum up FinCEN's most basic functions with 4 simple phrases. We collect, we connect, we detect, and we protect. And I'll go through each of those quickly. We collect. We collect over 55,000 records a day in a variety of reports, some focused on suspicious activity, some focused on movements of cash, some focused on certain types of accounts and wire transfers. The data that comes to us from the financial institutions we regulate is among the richest and most trusted data sets available to law enforcement. We connect. We connect that information to nearly 500 federal, state, and local law enforcement and regulatory agencies who have direct access to FinCEN's database of BSA records through a system we call FinCEN Query. There are roughly 11,000 users of the system who have made more than 10 million queries over the past 5 years. We also connect the dots in the information that we receive, helping law enforcement understand the networks behind illicit financial flows, and sharing with law enforcement and the private sector our expertise in analyzing the data. We also connect with other FIUs around the globe, fast-tracking the secure sharing of information that can help each other chase criminals, including drug traffickers, terrorists, and organized crime syndicates. We detect. We detect trends and patterns in illicit activity through our own in-depth analysis of the data, and we work with other parts of government to assist them in their own analysis in areas where they have the greatest concerns. And I'll stop and I'll give you an example there. FinCEN has a lot of experts who are really good at working with this data and identifying trends and patterns. But we're still a small agency, despite the fact that you saw some guy walking through something that looked like a huge database. That's just stock photo. That's clearly not our work space. But it's important for us to leverage the efforts of others who have access to the information. And I'll point out one recent example. The CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, recently published its own study based on suspicious activity reporting that they have access to in our database about trends and patterns with respect to elder fraud, a subject that they are particularly interested in. So this is a way in which the data that's provided to us isn't just for FinCEN's use and not just for law enforcement per se, but also for the regulatory community. We protect the highly sensitive data that we receive, and we ensure that it is used appropriately by our stakeholders. In addition to making law enforcement's use of the information more efficient through FinCEN's central collection efforts, FinCEN's protection of the data and ensuring that it is used only in appropriate circumstances is a critical component of balancing law enforcement access with data privacy. And finally, through all our efforts and those of our stakeholders, we protect the integrity of the U.S. financial system and in turn protect society from illicit actors. BSA data plays a critical role in keeping our country strong, our financial system secure, and our families safe from harm. When financial institutions report suspicions about elder fraud, human trafficking, cybercrime, narcotics trafficking, terrorism, or other illicit activity, they provide incredibly valuable leads and ongoing support for law enforcement and investigations. And importantly, they make it much harder for criminals to move or hide their illicit proceeds in the financial system. BSA data also aids in investigations tied to bulk cash smuggling, gang activity, significant fraud, transnational organized crime, bribery, healthcare fraud, corruption, embezzlement, kleptocracy, and third-party money laundering, among other crimes. All FBI subject names are run against the BSA database. More than 21% of FBI investigations use BSA data, and for some types of crime, like organized crime, nearly 60% of FBI investigations use BSA data. Roughly 20% of FBI international terrorism cases use BSA data. The IRS Criminal Investigation Section alone conducts more than 126,000 BSA database inquiries each year, and 24% of its investigations begin with a BSA source. In addition to providing controlled access to the data to law enforcement, FinCEN also proactively pushes certain information to them on critical topics. On a daily basis, FinCEN takes the suspicious activity reports and we run them through more than 100 automated business rules to identify reports that merit further review by our analysts. Our terrorist financing-related business rules alone generate over 1,000 matches each month for review and further dissemination to our law enforcement and regulatory partners in what we call a flash report. These flash reports enable the FBI, for example, to identify, track, and disrupt the activities of potential terrorist actors. It's incredibly valuable information. For more information about all the ways in which law enforcement uses FinCEN's data, I encourage you to go to our website, www.fincen.gov, where we've listed over 500 specific examples of how financial institution reporting has aided law enforcement cases. Our system is good, but it can always be improved. We see great opportunities in working with industry on innovations that can help them to better detect and safeguard against illicit activity. Innovation in a highly regulated environment can be tricky. Something new is something less known, and something less known usually creates fear, both for the regulated and the regulator. As a regulator with an interest in helping the private sector better identify and report illicit activity, FinCEN is taking steps to pave the way for more innovation and to remove some of that fear. In December, FinCEN, along with the federal banking agencies, issued a policy statement encouraging innovation in the banking sector. The statement notes that innovative pilot programs, in and of themselves, should not subject banks to supervisory criticism. even if the pilot programs are ultimately unsuccessful. And likewise, pilot programs that expose gaps in anti-money laundering compliance programs will not necessarily result in supervisory action with respect to that program. This was a simple statement, and yet it came as very welcome news to the banking sector. FinCEN regulates more than just banks, and there are many actors, including those that FinCEN doesn't regulate in the emerging technology space, that are pushing new innovation and new ways to collect and use information in the fight against crime. In light of this, just 2 weeks ago, FinCEN launched its Innovation Hours program, encouraging fintech and regtech companies, as well as financial institutions, to present new and innovative products and services for potential use in the financial sector to FinCEN. The goal here is to provide an environment in which FinCEN can better understand innovation as it happens and provide insight or other regulatory action to ensure that innovation and compliance with FinCEN's regulations and promotion of anti-money laundering goals generally can go hand in hand. I encourage both the industry and government participants here today to go to FinCEN's innovation page on our website to see how we've laid out this program and how we'll set up regular meetings with industry representatives. Several parts of ACT-IAC's agenda today touch on blockchain technology and/or virtual currency. FinCEN was among the first regulators to take steps in the virtual currency arena. In a 2011 rulemaking with respect to money transmitters and other money services businesses, FinCEN clarified that money transmission services include transmission of value that substitutes for currency. That simple but prescient phrasing by some smart FinCEN staffers put us in the position to later clarify how our existing regulations already covered issuers and exchangers of convertible virtual currency. Since then, FinCEN's engagement with the virtual currency industry has involved significant cooperation and appropriate enforcement. Virtual currency-related suspicious activity reports by those in that sector that have shown a willingness to abide by the rules are incredibly valuable to law enforcement. In 2016, FinCEN received roughly 500 SARs a month pertaining to virtual currency. In 2018 and 2019, that number is closing in on roughly 2,000 SARs a month. Nevertheless, there are still compliance concerns that we are working to address through examinations and enforcement actions. And we are also engaged in efforts to push for more consistent regulation in the virtual currency space on a multilateral basis. We've taken a number of enforcement actions in the virtual currency space over the years, and I'll just point out the most recent one involved a situation in which a peer-to-peer exchanger of convertible virtual currency was found in violation of our rules. They didn't have an anti-money laundering program. They didn't do the reporting that they did. It was our first enforcement action against a peer-to-peer exchanger. And it was also the first instance in which we penalized a virtual currency exchanger for failure to report currency transaction reports. More recently, May 9th, we actually issued some comprehensive guidance to industry on how our regulations apply in the convertible virtual currency context. The guidance didn't establish any new regulatory expectations, but it was a compilation of some of the things that we have been saying since we changed our rules over the years and provided greater clarity in terms of the way in which different business models and different actors in this space fall under our rules. And when they fall under our rules, they have to have the same type of anti-money laundering programs and reporting requirements and registration requirements as other money transmission services like Western Union or MoneyGram. On the same day, we also issued an advisory on illicit activity involving convertible virtual currency to assist financial institutions in identifying and reporting suspicious activities related to the criminal exploitation of CVCs for money laundering, sanctions evasion, and other illicit financing purposes. The advisory highlights prominent typologies associated with red flags and identifies information that would be most valuable to law enforcement if it were contained in suspicious activity reports. big part of what we're doing in the virtual currency space is to foster in that industry the same type of culture of compliance concepts that we have stressed for the rest of our regulated financial sector. It's been an interesting road in this regard, given that some of the early drivers and advocates of virtual currency touted it as a means of actually avoiding regulatory and law enforcement scrutiny. We are seeing some cultural changes. Some in the industry are now recognizing and touting the benefits of operating in a regulated space, actually using it as a selling point. Making sure that the virtual currency industry understands how the rules apply to them is essential. But so is working with them to help understand their roles as newer entities in a financial system that already has a strong culture of compliance. About 5 years ago, FinCEN provided some additional focus on the importance of an institution's culture when it came to anti-money laundering safeguards and reporting. The following principles were highlighted in FinCEN's 2014 guidance on a culture of compliance. A financial institution's leadership should be engaged in this. Compliance should not be compromised by revenue interests. Information should be shared throughout the organization. Leadership should provide adequate human and technological resources. The program should be effective and tested by an independent and competent party. And the leadership and staff should understand how BSA reports are used. Those are some principles that could apply to a culture of compliance anywhere in our regulatory system. Much of what we list in our notions of culture of compliance is based on years of experience working with our U.S. financial institutions and is rooted in common understandings of how businesses work here within the context of our own financial and legal system. It's not just understanding the Bank Secrecy Act that underpins a culture of compliance. It's also understanding the broader culture of compliance that we are fortunate to have here in the United States. It's based on things that we all grow up understanding. The belief that individuals can make a difference, the notion that if you see something, you say something, notions of workplace protections and accountability, respect for the rule of law, the ability to question authority, belief in our judicial system, the belief that law enforcement protects people rather than subjugates them, and the understanding that no system is perfect and that we can always work to make our system better. All of these concepts and more, things that we sometimes take for granted, underpin what FinCEN calls a culture of compliance. Institutions operating in different environments globally may not have the same underpinnings that we have. I bring out examples of jurisdictions where there's actually the opposite of if you see something, say something. If you say something in a jurisdiction where you're going to get in trouble, you're not going to do it. There are places with less distinction between public and private sector activity or between sovereign and private sector wealth. And there are places where there may be less trust between government and people and less of a view that government is the servant of people. I often I have friends and family all over the globe, and in some discussions with them, I basically say that if I were in trouble overseas, I would simply find my way to the embassy and ask for help. And they look at me and they basically say, if they were in a situation overseas, the last place that they would go for help is their own government. So how can we talk about a culture of compliance for institutions in jurisdictions and parts of the world that don't have the same underpinnings that we have? How does what we talk about here with respect to a culture of compliance get translated in other jurisdictions? Does it even get discussed? As we work together to create a global financial system with greater resilience to illicit activity, it's important for us to discuss how promoting a culture of compliance in the anti-money laundering space can work for the benefit of institutions outside the United States. It's also important for FinCEN to raise this with our fellow regulators. No system is perfect, In the United States, we continue to look for ways in which we can improve how our financial sector and law enforcement can work together to combat illicit activity. But in this space, as in so many others, we have the opportunity to lead by example. When we are engaging with our counterparts overseas, we need to talk about the concept of a culture of compliance in the United States and what underpins it, and explore with our counterparts concepts that could underpin a culture of compliance in their own jurisdictions. All institutions need to be concerned about their reputations, and business professionals everywhere need to be concerned about their personal reputations. Reputation risk, personal honor, institutional pride, national pride, those are all potentially some building blocks to work with in other jurisdictions that may not have the same underpinnings as those that support our own notion of a culture of compliance. And focus on anti-money laundering and an anti-money laundering culture can have positive effects on other aspects of business operations. So we need to talk to our overseas colleagues about the benefits of a strong culture of compliance. And we also need to talk to them about the risks that they run within their institutions and their jurisdictions if an anti-money laundering compliance culture is not fostered. Much is at stake when a business anywhere puts its reputation at risk. And as we get better about sharing information between and among mindful governments and industry actors, those that are less mindful about identifying and thwarting illicit activity will stick out. Why are we so concerned about the things that we're concerned about, and why am I pushing for what may be difficult conversations about a culture of compliance with colleagues in newer industries or colleagues overseas? We do it for the sake of protecting our communities through the protection and integrity of our financial systems. We do it for national security reasons. These are huge concerns. But we also do it for some simpler reasons, too. And I'll end with a story. I was in a jurisdiction that I won't name that's known for it's rife with corruption. And the State Department had set up meetings for me with bankers and government officials, but they also set up a smaller session with some people in non-governmental organizations. And we were talking about corruption in the jurisdiction and what they could do to try to break the cycle. And the people there, a lady in particular just said, this is the system that we have. It's what we're used to. It's what we grow up with. And I thought, and I said, well, if it's what you grow up with, at what point do you as a parent talk to your children about it? At what point do you have to engage them in a conversation to explain to them, why you might have been shaken down by a law enforcement official or something else that's going wrong in the society? And she thought, and her answer was 8 years old. She thought it was about 8 years old when they had to have that type of conversation. And I said, well, maybe if you're more vocal about the fact that you as a community have to have those conversations when your children are 8 years old, maybe that's the beginning of potentially working together to address some of these issues. So I came home after that, and I just realized how lucky I am that I don't have to have that type of conversation with my children, particularly not at 8 years old. There's no system that's perfect, and we do have to have difficult conversations with our children at times when there are injustices that have not been addressed. That exists. But with respect to a general system of corruption, we don't have to do that. I have faith in the system that we have here. We all have faith in the system that we have here. I have particular faith in the financial sector's ability to work with law enforcement to actually fight corruption and root out illicit activity. And whether you're in the financial system or not, you participate or benefit from relationships between and among private sector and government that are instrumental in fighting corruption and other illicit activity. I want you to appreciate that and think about that when you go home, and the fact that you don't have to have the types of conversations that they have to have elsewhere in the world. I also want to close by thanking you for your interest in the important work that we do, and hope that some of you here today will look at our website and think about how in your own industry you can contribute to a culture of compliance in which business interests and government interests against illicit actors align. Where there is a will, there's a way, and we all have to do what we can to make the world a better place. Thank you. And I'm not sure what the timing is here, if there's a time for a question or not, because I know that your schedule has changed. So I see one hand. Oh, and I'm not answering any questions by the press. Those go to our press office. So please identify yourself.
Thanks. Mac Warner, West Virginia Secretary of State. One of the troubling trends recently has been this ransomware with municipalities, Atlanta, Baltimore, various other cities and so forth. Two questions. One is, can you shed any light on who the bad actors might be? Are we talking terrorism, nation-state actors, just criminals, gangs, whatever? That's the first part of the question. And the second is combating that. Any sort of statutory regulation that would prohibit municipalities from paying such ransomware to decrease the likelihood of future, or do you have some sort of solution for us in that regard?
Well, I'll start by saying I won't get into aspects about changing the law in terms of whether or not a municipality can actually pay ransomware or make it illegal. Those are things that are above my pay grade. But you do raise an example of something that we are focused on and we're discussing at FinCEN and with our law enforcement colleagues. A lot of people will say, because we have virtual currency experts and are trying to track the flow of assets through that system, say, well, how much of it is bad? And that's a difficult question to answer. But we have noted that with respect to dark web activities and with respect to ransomware issues particularly, a choice of method of moving the funds is generally through virtual currency. It's at a very high percentage. So we have folks that focus on blockchain analysis. We have folks that work with law enforcement to glean what we can in terms of following those flows. And in the advisories that we put out to industry in terms, and including the virtual currency sector itself and their reporting, we focus with them on the types of information that's going to be useful for law enforcement to try to track down the activity. Now, I can't get into specifics on particular cases, but I can say, and I mentioned it earlier, that those within the virtual currency space that are abiding by the rules and that are working with law enforcement are actually providing very useful information. And I do think that the more we work with them and the more we understand how we can track activities and the more we actually make sure that people in that space are following the rules, the greater we will have transparency, as we do in some other areas, to try to identify the perpetrators. We have suspicious activity reports in the system that are particularly focused on a situation in which ransoms through virtual currency have been paid. And then we provide that to law enforcement, and we work with law enforcement to try to track down the bad guys. It's a tough issue, and that's why on our end it's very important for us, and you come from the State Department, to focus on how other jurisdictions are regulating virtual currency as well. Because if it's not regulated, if it's unregulated in other parts of the world, there's going to be plenty of opportunity where there will be absolutely no visibility. At least here in the United States, we are working to have some of the visibility that would be similar to when funds go through the banking system. Hope that's provides you with an answer. And With that, I'm going to thank you all again for your time and enjoy the rest of your session. You've got a great agenda. Thank you.